unfiltered. I teared up watching it because I've known Sharon a long time. She's a very, very close friend of mine. And when I saw Sharon without her Ozzy, you know, it did make me choke up, actually, that very picture.
There are kings and queens and politicians and like you and all kinds of people. Not everybody likes them. Ozzy is universally loved. People love Ozzy.
But you're so right about Sharon. You know, Sharon was his massive protective shield. If she saw journalists or celebrities mocking Ozzy for the way he talked or whatever, she would go absolutely ballistic in his defense.
He credits much of his sobriety to Sharon's tough love.
Sharon!
What has she done to help you get where you are?
She wouldn't take any crap.
But amid all this chaos, one voice cut through with unusual clarity, and it was Piers Morgan's, known for his unfiltered hot takes, for ripping into celebrities with acidic commentary, and for turning grief into primetime TV. Piers surprised everyone with the tone of his first reaction. Sitting stiff in a London studio, he didn't smirk, he didn't gloat, he didn't even sensationalize. Instead, his first words were, "This is the end of an era." Ozzy wasn't just a musician, he was chaos made human, and chaos just died.
I got to say, it was a real gut punch to me hearing the news about Ozzy, not because it was surprising that he reached his late 70s and then had died, because he challenged his body for many decades in a way that would have finished lesser mortals off. But it was the fact that it came just 2 weeks after this extraordinary farewell show back in Birmingham, where it all began for him. The poignancy of Ozzy dying just 2 weeks later was very striking, I thought. What were your thoughts when you heard?
But as Piers began to speak, his audience realized there was something more behind his voice. This wasn't just another celebrity death to him. He had been inside the Osborne circus before. He had interviewed Ozzy and Sharon multiple times, dined with them, even sparred with Sharon on air. He had seen their marriages' cracks, their reconciliations, their fights. And when the world was asking what Sharon's reaction would be, Piers already knew, because he had seen her break before, in smaller ways, behind the curtain.
And I do think that even though it's very sad that he's died, I do think it was quite wonderful that the last thing he did in public life was to go back to his hometown with his old band, surrounded by mates, Metallica, Guns N' Roses and others, and to put on what was a terrific show. I saw some of the clips online. It was fantastic. And he was in this, he was in a wheelchair where they put him in a big black throne and they rose him up. And for that night, Ozzy was king again, back in Birmingham with his mates, with all his family backstage. And I just think if he could have scripted, actually, the last we ever saw of him, it wouldn't get better than that.
If you thought Ozzy's life was a spectacle, he teased, just wait until you hear how his death was handled. It was a kind of statement only Piers could get away with, part promise, part threat. And it immediately left people hungry for details.
Rock music.
The most famous, of course, being the time he ate the bat on stage. Now, people probably don't know the half of this, but I think originally they thought it was a toy bat that had been thrown on stage, and he picked it up instinctively and took a big old munch. And at that point, he realized it was actually a real bat. And I once asked him, I said, what was it like? And he went, well, I'll tell you one thing, he said, bats taste fucking awful.
Oh, my God.
But let's take a look at a clip of him talking about the bat. That's what.
Behind the scenes, however, the Osborne family had locked everything down. Invitations to the memorial service were said to be handwritten by Sharon herself. The location wasn't announced to the public. Security was reportedly tighter than a state funeral. And yet, somehow, Piers was there. He had managed to secure entry to the most secretive rock and roll farewell in history, and what he witnessed will haunt him and everyone else in attendance forever, because this wasn't just a funeral. This was the unraveling of a dynasty, a family spectacle filled with tears, rage, unresolved feuds, and one shocking collapse that Piers swore was unlike anything he had ever seen.
It was quite a poignant interview, actually, because for all the kind of naughty behaviour underpinning it, Ozzy couldn't live without Sharon, and Sharon couldn't live without Ozzy. And that's what's so sad, I think, about today, is that Sharon now doesn't have him. And my heart genuinely breaks for her for that.
And the kids, the father is gone.
Yeah.
The patriarch. I mean, it's just
Ozzy Osbourne, Piers said with a smirk, was buried like a king of chaos. Only the Osbornes could have pulled it off. When the black cars began to roll up, the scene outside looked less like a funeral and more like a secret rock summit. Elton John stepped out first, dressed not in flamboyant feathers, but in a somber black coat, his head bowed so low it barely looked like him. Paul McCartney followed, his presence almost biblical, a Beatle there to honor the Prince of Darkness. Slash, in his trademark top hat, refused to remove it even as he entered the candlelit chamber, muttering to those nearby that Ozzy would have wanted it this way. Behind him came Metallica's Lars Ulrich, Dave Grohl, Alice Cooper, and even Mick Jagger, his face unreadable behind dark shades. And then came Sharon, gripping Jack and Kelly by the hands, walking as if her body had aged 20 years in a single week. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but Piers Morgan painted the picture in brutal detail later. She was a ghost walking among giants. Every single person in that room knew that as much as this was Ozzy's farewell, it was Sharon's crucifixion. The chamber was lit with hundreds of black candles, their flames trembling against the stone walls. In the center rested Ozzy's coffin, not polished oak, not gold-plated, but matte black, carved with bats and crosses. On top sat a single crown of red roses, and beneath it, a folded Union Jack, a reminder that though Ozzy was chaos incarnate, he was also Britain's most unlikely cultural export. The atmosphere was suffocating. This was no ordinary farewell.
And anyone that was around them, like I used to be, a lot, it was one of the strongest relationships I've ever seen. Always incredibly entertaining, incredibly down to earth, very friendly, very solicitous, always asking about the family and the life and how things are going. But you're so right about Sharon. You know, Sharon was his massive protective shield. If I was with her when people, if she saw journalists or celebrities mocking Ozzy for the way he talked or whatever, she would go absolutely ballistic in his defense. And she was a ferocious lioness. And she, you know, by her own admission, they did not have the perfect marriage at all. You know, Ozzy was a pretty naughty boy for a long time, but she never doubted the strength of their union. And anyone that was around them, like I used to be, a lot, it was one of the strongest relationships I've ever seen. They had an unbelievably deep.
It was a collision of worlds. Heavy metal legends stood shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood stars, aristocrats, and television executives. Piers, who sat 2 rows behind Sharon, later admitted he couldn't stop staring at the raw mix of grief and awkwardness. Half the people in that room hated each other, he said. And yet Ozzy's death forced them together like oil and fire. One by one, friends and family began to speak. Elton John, usually unflappable, broke down mid-sentence, recalling a night in the 1970s when he and Ozzy stumbled drunk into Buckingham Palace and were almost arrested by royal guards. Slash remembered being on tour with Guns N' Roses when Ozzy suddenly showed up backstage uninvited, barefoot, with a live frog in his pocket. Because, as Ozzy told him, frogs bring luck. Even Paul McCartney, usually careful with words, admitted that in his darkest days after the Beatles, it was Ozzy's sheer madness that reminded him life was worth living. But as the laughter and tears flowed, all eyes inevitably turned to Sharon. She was silent through most of the tributes, her body stiff, her face pale. When it was finally her turn to speak, the silence was so sharp it felt like the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Sharon stood, her hand trembling on the podium, and began, "I don't know how to live without him." That was all it took. Her voice cracked, and she crumbled before the entire room. Jack rushed forward to catch her as her knees gave way. Kelly sobbed uncontrollably, and the entire memorial dissolved into chaos.
How close did you come, Sharon, to kicking him out?
Oh, I was just really broken in every sense.
She cut every sleeve off every coat I own.
Did you?
Yeah. I said to Ozzy, if you ever do this to me again, I'm going to cut your hair off or I'm going to cut all your clothes.
Would you rather have had your hair all cut off or the clothes?
I wish I hadn't done the stupid thing that I did to get to warrant that happening. And that's the truth, because you never know what you've had until you've lost it. And I thought I'd lost big time.
Piers Morgan, who had been scribbling notes like a courtroom reporter, later admitted he stopped writing at that moment. "I realized I wasn't watching a memorial anymore," he said. "I was watching the collapse of a woman who had fought the world for decades and finally lost." What happened next, however, would ignite a storm far beyond the Abbey walls. Because Sharon's collapse didn't just move the mourners, it exposed the fractures in the Osborne dynasty and in the rock and roll family that surrounded them. And Piers, with cameras waiting for him outside, was ready to make sure the whole world knew exactly what he'd seen.